and I'm hoping that just over time he'll get distracted by all the rest of the work I'm doing and forget that he suggested this thing in the first place.
Okay.
And then I won't have to do it. I got a little bit angry, I have to confess, because I felt like I was wasting my time. I found it particularly difficult to believe that I would ever get angry with my supervisors for some reason.
De bägge handledarna har helt olika åsikter och så får doktoranden vara förmedlaren, och det kan vara väldigt jobbigt för doktoranden.
I went on a lot of tangents at the beginning of my PhD and wasted a lot of time because I wasn't confident in what I was doing.
I can think of at least one example where it went wrong.
I mean, there's certainly things I would have done differently if I was starting my PhD again.
Och olika handledare ger ju olika råd.
Well, I was quite stressed about it.
Kvarstående vänskap, roliga stunder tillsammans, svett och tårar.
I wish that I'd gone on the course about assertiveness.
Så på ett socialt plan har det varit viktigt också. Kan man inte få vänner på annat sätt så kan man få det genom att skaffa sig många doktorander.
Does anyone tell you this from the beginning, or do you have to discover it yourself?
Yourself.
Yeah.
No one tells you anything about this?
Well, I think sometimes they do and you don't believe them because you're like, well, you know, this is an exciting journey. I'm going to do a PhD. It's going to be great. And I'm sure I'll figure it out. And then when it actually happens, you think, oh, this is...
My name is Ronny Gunnarsson and I am a general practitioner. Over the past 15 years I have partially worked with research and supervision of PhD students. I wanted to improve myself as supervisor and therefore I interviewed supervisors and PhD students. All interviews were videotaped and it was about 6 hours feedstock. All thoughts and ideas expressed could be categorized and sorted into 3 main topics. The first topic, the good example, how to prevent and manage problems in the relationship between PhD students and their supervisors. The second topic, disagreements are mostly okay. Disagreements between PhD student and supervisors occur. Although it may feel uncomfortable, it is mostly okay. Third topic, the new PhD education. What changes have taken place in the PhD education and where will it end? What are the strengths and weaknesses with the ongoing changes? Let us now see and hear the thoughts that emerged in the interviews regarding the second topic. Disagreements are mostly okay. Disagreements between PhD student and supervisors occurs. It's dangerous. Although it may feel uncomfortable, it is mostly okay. The PhD student will in the end graduate, and this can be a step to a more interesting job, but what's in it for the supervisor?
I think there's 2 sets of skills I've learned. So one is generic skills about managing people, supervising students. So as I've taken on more students, I've acquired skills, generic skills in dealing with more junior research staff, PhD students. So there are some generic skills I've learned about handling people, trying to agree shared objectives, agreeing targets which can be monitored and measured. So there's some generic skills I've learned. And then for each project there's always some skills that are linked to that project. So if I do a new area of work, I might learn something about that area. So for example, the student who did the work on drugs overdoses and death from drug overdose, I learned a lot about the field from him. So I knew the research methodology, the actual subject itself I wasn't so familiar with, but working with him I learned a lot about about drugs overdoses and drugs policy.
Well, apart from learning a lot about subjects about which I was ignorant, content and methods, you learn. It's always a learning, a general learning experience.
Att vara doktorand är ju en temporär sak. Men jag tycker det är väldigt kul när man har fortsatta kontakter med doktorander. Jag kan säga att det har ju varit en av de verkligt stora glädjen i livet att ha fortsatta kontakter med mina doktorander. Alltså, jag har 4 doktorerade allmänläkare i Island som jag har räknat till mina närmaste vänner i livet, trots att avståndet är en bit.
The supervisor learns both how to manage people, but above all learn about a lot of different subjects. Sometimes there are even new friends for life. Let's start listening to some common problems as PhD students experience them.
He comes up with a lot of ideas in a very short space of time. So you go in with a meeting with him and you'll come away with 10 things that you could try or do, and he says them with an enormous amount of confidence, as if that he's studied these subjects very closely and he thinks that this is a definite course you should take. But it sometimes you realise when you're going through them that actually he's just tossed them off the top of his head. He's been like, yeah, try that, why not? And he's just thought of it just that instant, because especially when I started, I thought, oh well, he's a professor. Well, he's not a professor, but as in he's my supervisor. He's experienced. He knows about these things. So I kind of treated every suggestion he made as a really serious thing that I should definitely pursue until I'd exhausted that possibility. Whereas now he can toss a few things off, and I'm a bit more like, well, no, I can't really be bothered to follow that up because I know you've just thought about it in about 5 seconds.
Den situationen jag tänker på var jag själv väldigt säker på att jag hade rätt, men eftersom min handledare som besatt kunskapen ännu mer än jag motsatte sig detta, blev jag osäker, ja. Så jag blev osäker.
Hur hanterar du din osäkerhet?
Jag talade om för honom att jag inte riktigt förstod det här. Men att jag fick acceptera det.
Okej. Så om jag förstår det rätt så blev det så att du tyckte i ett vägval där så tyckte du en sak och en av dina handledare tyckte en annan sak. Och du tyckte egentligen att du hade rätt, men du la dig där. Hur kändes det efteråt?
Det kändes inte bra därför jag hade rätt. Och det kom ju fram sen.
In the middle of my kind of PhD and around this time, I haven't met with my supervisors very often. So they're sometimes quite far behind on what I'm actually doing. So I feel I'll go in and I'll say, okay, I've reached this result, and they'll have kind of forgotten about what I've been doing up until that point. And I know a bit more about especially about my own work and about my own field than they do. So they'll disagree on something which is something I've already dealt with, and I've thought of that objection before and I've handled it by myself, but they obviously don't know that. And sometimes that can make things a bit awkward because they feel like I'm being dismissive of their objections when it's just because I've thought of that already, and I don't want to go through it all again with somebody else because I've realised it's a dead end or something.
So probably just initially to do with what exactly would be in my PhD. So perhaps my feeling that the content of my PhD was being led by their research interests rather than perhaps exactly what I wanted to do. But I don't know if that was a communication thing. So better communication needs to being able to sort that out, because I've ended up doing what I want to do. So it's fine in the end.
Olika handledare ger ju olika råd. Och jag vet inte, jag känner ju mig också på något sätt lite sådär förpliktigad att informera även mina alla handledare så att säga, vad som är på gång och vad jag gör, och i alla fall när det är så med artiklarna så är det ju ibland så att mer än en handledare är med på artikeln, och då är de ju medförfattare och då ska ju man ha en dialog med alla. Och när de då är handledare så är det klart att få en synpunkt därifrån, en annan synpunkt därifrån. Och då har jag ju på något sätt att balansera upp allt det här.
Now I have a good relationship with my supervisors,
Yes.
but initially I found it quite difficult to get the support I needed because I felt that in the first year of the PhD I needed a lot of support to get me started, and it was perhaps more difficult than I would have liked to get that. Now that I'm in the third year, it's fine because I found my feet and I know what I'm doing, and I have a good relationship with my supervisors, but initially that was a bit difficult. Also, I have an external supervisor at a different university in London, and I found it difficult trying to manage the relationship between my external supervisor and my internal supervisor here at Imperial. Well, I was quite stressed about it at the time, and now I look back and think perhaps I shouldn't have worried about it so much.
Okay.
But at the time I was upset about it.
Okay.
But then my other supervisors tell me that one of the things about doing a PhD is that you learn to manage people, to work with people who have different working styles to you, and so these things should be viewed as learning experiences.
These people are academic supervisors. They're rational people. I'm a rational person. Any disagreement we have, we can work through it. But you don't realise that because it's your work and you've spent so much time putting effort into it, that people on both sides, and they're worried about you finishing your PhD. So there's kind of emotions on both sides, and you don't want to acknowledge that that might happen. That actually people might get emotional about it. I don't know. I found it particularly difficult to believe that I would ever get angry with my supervisors for some reason.
And probably there's an element of personality in there as well, but you know that you just kind of get on well with each other, and you know who knows how. Sometimes that happens, sometimes it doesn't. There are colleagues of mine who've had very different experiences with different supervisors to mine.
Ja, en sak kanske då, även om jag inte har varit i det läget, men jag kan tänka mig att det uppkommer situationer när vilket jag har hört någon gång då från någon annan doktorand i samband med någon disputation, att det kan uppkomma situationer när handledaren, alltså du får en sån konflikt med din handledare eller din huvudhandledare att det går liksom inte att fortsätta att jobba tillsammans. Och då ska man väl, precis som i ett urtaskigt äktenskap, då ska man väl på något sätt kunna sitta ner och resonera om det och finna att nej, men det här funkar ju faktiskt inte. Vi får gå vidare på skilda håll och vi får hitta en annan handledare till dig och så här. Alltså, jag antar att den situationen kan uppkomma, fast det gäller ju inte mig, men alltså, då är det väl bättre, om det ska bli något av det hela, så är det väl bättre att man tar en diskussion om detta och sen löser det på något sätt.
Common problems that PhD students talk about are: the student may not have enough influence on important decisions. The supervisor is not always up to date concerning the project. The supervisor sometimes gives bad advice. The student may have to mediate between different supervisors. Personal chemistry and emotion plays a role. Are there disagreements between PhD students and their supervisors?
No, I can't say there's ever been a difference of opinion about that sort of...
Difference in what to do or how to analyze or...
No, I mean, we often have discussions about what the best thing to do and how to analyse, but I can't say there have been disagreements. It's been a discussion which we resolve depending on the situation. We haven't had any conflict situations. I have known of examples where there have been conflict with other supervisors, but it hasn't been my experience.
I think on the whole, we've always managed to reach consensus.
Mostly we have had reasonable concordance of views. I haven't had any very difficult students, but there have been occasions where I have found students making quite major decisions about the direction of the project without discussion.
So
I think my main conflicts have occurred before I've agreed to take them on. But once I've taken them on, I think our relationships have been fine.
I det brukar ju inte egentligen vara att man har direkta konflikter utan att man har olika syn på det hela.
I think by and large we've always gotten fairly well. I'm trying to think of any situation where we've not agreed. I think sometimes students can be a bit overambitious about their work, and my view is always that it's better to do a simple project and do it well rather than try to take on too much at the start. So sometimes there's some discussion about the scope of the project, and in my view is also my view is always it's better to do a simple project initially, and later on if you're doing well you can always add on additional layers of work, but initially it's best to do something that's not too overambitious, because by and large the students are working by themselves, they don't have a research assistant or administrative support, and so they can't do a project that's too ambitious. So I think that's probably the main area of disagreement.
Yes, I had one student who graduated last year who was very headstrong and wanted to carry on doing more and more experiments without making sure that the data she had was robust enough. And so we had a disagreement because I wanted her to go back and make sure that the data that she had was good, whereas she wanted to carry on and do more and more different things.
Ja, det tror jag alla handledare har varit, att det dyker upp situationer där man inte når en kompromiss utan man måste välja si eller så att säga.
Ja, fast alltså någon sån här riktig kollisionssituation, det kan jag inte, det tror jag inte jag har varit med om.
Har du haft någon doktorand där ni har gått igenom hela processen och ni har egentligen aldrig tyckt olika i någon vägvalsfråga?
Nej, det kan jag nog inte säga. Det har liksom bara flutit på en motorväg fram till disputation. Nej.
My supervisor asked me to do some individual country analyses, to do just one country and try and do that first. And I looked at it and I tried to get it done, and I realised with the exposure I was using it couldn't work. And he didn't accept that was the case. And we had some arguments about that.
In that argument, how certain were you about your course?
The first time we argued, not very certain at all. So I went away and spent quite a lot of time trying to make the method that he had explained to me work. And then after a while and some discussions with some other people who were in the department, I realised that there's no way that it could work.
But in the beginning, where you were not confident in your course, and,
no, I wasn't.
And the supervisor told you you're wrong.
Yeah.
How did you feel?
Well, I felt like, okay, well, he probably knows more about it than I do,
yes.
So I'll go away and try and understand better. I felt like I'd misunderstood him, and I'd try and go away and understand it better,
yeah.
And then at some point I'd realise that I was wrong, because that had happened several times up until then. I'd gone in thinking one thing, and he'd explained it to me one way, and I'd gone away and realised that actually he was right. But in this instance, it turned out that he was wrong. Or, well, that's still an open question. He still doesn't accept that he's wrong. But I can't see a way of making it work.
PhD students expressed more than the supervisors that disagreement and sometimes conflicts occur. The supervisors acknowledge that transient disagreements but not conflicts exist. If disagreement occurs, how does it feel? Is it dangerous? Should it be avoided?
If he doesn't accept your opinion,
yeah,
and you're by the time gradually more certain that you're right, how do you deal with that situation?
I got a little bit angry, I have to confess, because I felt like I was wasting my time doing something which I knew wasn't going to go anywhere, and wasting my time basically accumulating the evidence that I required to show him that this thing didn't work when I already knew that it didn't work.
If there are conflicts, it can be a symptom that the development process isn't proceeding properly. And as we've said earlier on, in the first year students need a lot of support, where perhaps you might be more didactic in your direction. As they become more experienced in the area, then you can be more flexible and allow them to develop ideas. And I think if there are conflicts in the first year, for example, it may be that they're trying to do too much and, as we say, try to run before they can walk, perhaps.
The difficulty with being a PhD supervisor is that the student thinks about nothing else, and you think about it sometimes for maybe 1 hour every 3 or 4 weeks, and so it's sometimes quite difficult in a PhD supervision session to get up to date in your mind, up to speed as quickly as you need, and so you occasionally find yourself being outmaneuvered and outthought by the student because they haven't prepared you for what's coming, you haven't quite remembered the last supervision, and they're ahead of you. So occasionally I felt outmaneuvered. I felt that she, had developed ideas which I hadn't had time to become familiar with, and so occasionally I felt that I wasn't quite in control, which is probably reflects me as much as anything else. But
I can give another example. One of my students who did a very successful PhD, looking at the impact of, he was looking at mortality from drug overdoses in the UK. So at one point he wanted to do a very complex analysis on it using what's called interrupted time series, which I'd never used before and had no experience of. So I wasn't really sure about this because I had no experience of this statistical methodology, its strengths, its limitations, how it can be applied. But he made a very strong case that this was the right methodology to use. In this case, because I didn't understand the methodology, if we had done something incorrect, I wouldn't really have been able to detect that because of my lack of knowledge of the methodology. So I felt uncertain. It's like going off in a car on a road you've never been before. You're not quite sure where to turn or what direction to take. So in the same way, I felt uncertain about this because of my lack of experience, and I felt, well, if he does it incorrectly and doesn't do it correctly, then I won't be able to detect that. So that was my main concern. My initial concern was, as I mentioned, that I didn't really understand the methodology, and so if he did an incorrect analysis, I may not be able to detect that. And clearly, if that's published in his thesis or in a research paper, it's not very good for him or for myself or for the department if we do something that's very flawed in its methodology. So that was my initial concern. My other concern was that he wouldn't have the right skills to do this quite complex analysis, and he would get stuck, and then we would have done the work and it would have been wasted. So those are my two main concerns initially.
Could you describe the feeling of that doubt before the
reviews?
Yes.
I think there's just there's just some uncertainty that people might write back and say, well, actually, this is completely incorrect. These people are idiots. They don't know what they're doing. The methodology is completely flawed. So there's always that slight doubt that someone might write back, a peer reviewer might write back and say, well, actually, these two academics didn't know what they were doing. They've done this totally incorrectly. The whole work was a complete waste of time. So that doubt is always there until you get your external peer review comments. So it wasn't. I mean, it wasn't a major doubt, but sometimes it's just there in your mind that perhaps the peer reviewers will think this work isn't actually very good. I think if you're a supervisor, there's always some doubt in your mind because as an academic, you're always fairly thinking critically. So there's always some issue sometimes when you feel a bit uncertain and you have to go back and think, well, what does the evidence say? What's my previous experience on this? Am I correct in this?
Innan ni så att säga nådde ert konsensus och bestämde oss för att nu gör vi så här. Innan ni hade kommit dit, kände du dig helt säker på den linje du drev, eller kände du någon form av även viss osäkerhet?
Ständig osäkerhet kan man säga.
Ständig osäkerhet?
Ja.
Hur hanterar du den?
Alltså jag jobbar kanske alldeles för mycket med magkänsla. Men alltså man får ju prova olika vägar när man känner att det inte funkar. Alltså att doktoranden inte är inne på linjen. Och då får man ju kolla och se om det kanske, eller gå in på den andra stigen. Men jag tycker att jag har aldrig känt den där totala, ibland, någon gång sådär, ibland känner jag den där totala övertygelsen att min väg är rätt. Men det är väldigt sällan. Utan det är väldigt mycket det här med liksom att man hela tiden ska försöka hitta någon sorts gemensamt, och vad som är rätt och fel, det är jättesvårt att säga, tycker jag, i de allra flesta fall.
Det här när man hamnar i en situation där man tycker olika, om låt oss säga en metodfråga, ett vägval, är det något man bör undvika?
Nej, det är ju inte. Alltså för det handlar också om naturligtvis den individuella doktoranden. Alltså hur pass känslig han eller hon är för motstånd. För vissa personer är ju kastar sig glatt över det, blir nästan utmanade och blir väldigt, alltså går upp på en ny nivå och presterar mera, medan andra blir totalt bara ramlar ihop i en liten hög. Så att i många fall ska man ju liksom inte följa med för mycket, tycker jag. Men det beror på hur doktorandens personlighet också.
Känner du själv en osäkerhet då kring vem som egentligen har rätt?
Ja, visst. Alltså jag abdikerar kanske ibland väl snabbt nästan, för jag kan en hel del, men jag vet att jag har liksom vita fält i min egen forskning som jag absolut vidkänner ganska tidigt också, tycker jag, i förhållande till den. Så att kommer den andra och alltså doktoranden då säger att ja, men så här är det så ja, jag kan ju tycka det är kanske så. Då är det säkert så, tror jag. Och jag litar på doktoranden, för det där också med tillit på den personen att göra. En del tycker jag sett över åren, en del litar jag stenhårt på. Man ser ganska tidigt alltså kvalitet, och andra som är lite mera fasad, eller vad ska jag säga, som liksom lär sig någon jargong eller slänger sig med ord och sådär och ska imponera. Men sitter det verkligen gjutet så de står med fötterna på då är det ju en oerhörd glädje, och där är ju mycket lärorikt moment i det, att man lär sig själv på det. Sakfrågor kan man på något sätt lösa på ett annat sätt. När det gäller frågan om den eller den metoden, eller skulle man komplettera med den studien eller göra den, det kan man, då tar man ofta in någon tredje person och säger vi måste höra med någon annan, en statistiker, en epidemiolog, någon som kan det här bättre än vad du och jag kan. Det är bra att få in tredje person och låt dem få berätta. Men det tunga är när de lägger på bordet en stor uppgivenhet och en vilja att inte gå vidare.
Och ju vanligare doktoranden blir, desto mer förstår vi själva av sitt arbete och kan ju också ställa kritiska frågor på ett annat sätt. Så att det är en naturlig del i processen förstås. Och det upplever jag inte som något problem, utan mer som tecken på att doktoranden mognar när de börjar ifrågasätta och diskutera val, så att säga. Och det tycker jag att jag har en av de saker jag har lärt mig att hantera bättre. För i början är man lite mer osäker på sig själv och man kanske är lite mer prestigebunden och låser sig vid hur man har tänkt först och har svårare att ändra sig. I alla fall upplevde jag det i början. Men så känner jag inte alls det, utan tvärtom är jag mer förutsättningslös i de diskussioner vi har, så att säga. Det är snarare en fördel om man kan justera och göra bättre. Och som doktoranden föreslår någonting så är det ju ofta välgrundat tycker jag, för de är ju inne i sitt forskningsprojekt och har läst en massa litteratur och har en känsla för materialet, så att jag tycker att det är ofta bra förslag.
Det här att man tycker olika i en kanske viktigt metodval och inte kan reda ut det omedelbart. Är det något som bör undvikas?
Nej, jag tycker att det är bland de mer stimulerande tillfällena i handledning av doktorander. Det är då det händer någonting, det är då man lär sig något nytt så att säga. Faktiskt.
Vem lär sig något nytt?
Jag lär mig nytt och doktoranden lär sig nytt. Så att det är ett gemensamt lärande. Det tycker jag att det är ju det forskningen är. Det är ju ett förlängt lärande när böckerna tar slut så att säga. Va? Så att det är ju obruten mark och det måste man vara medveten om att det är på det sättet.
The student have different ideas and you want them to explore different possibilities and to present you with challenges. I think and that goes back to Newton and Einstein. I mean, if you don't have differing views, you're not getting anywhere. And so the whole thing should be, I think, a dialogue and should entail the generation of contrasting views and consideration of different points.
Disagreement between student and supervisor can be a hazard and give rise to strong emotions. Disagreements can sometimes be seen as an expression of immaturity of the PhD student, but more commonly the supervisors see it as an expression of maturity of the PhD student. With the last approach, disagreement is not threatening. After listening to these interviews, a few questions appear. There are no obvious answers, but the questions are worth a discussion. The first question: is there a value in sharing experiences of disagreement? The second question: if yes to the first question, in what context should it be done to be constructive?